for today is nervous system. And the first thing which I would like to draw your attention towards is the color, that is the yellow color, which is the code for the nerves which are drawn in the anatomy. So nervous system is divided into central and peripheral nervous system, or can be divided into autonomic or somatic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we won't be going into their physiological aspect as much, but we'll be dealing with what their anatomical locations are and what exactly constitutes them. So first thing which I would like to discuss with you guys is the functional component of nervous system. If you see the diagram of a spinal cord, you will observe that there is this posterior horn and there is this anterior horn on both the sides. The posterior horn constitutes of sensory cells and the anterior horn, it constitutes the motor cells. This is a very basic thing which we have been learning since old school days. And lateral horn is present in some of the spinal segments, basically the thoracic segments, right? So these three horns, we know that sensory cells are the ones which basically carry the efferent impulses from the periphery, and motor cells are the ones which will give efferent to the peripheral muscles so that they can contract. But it is not that simple. It is just not the sensory supply from the somatic system and efferent supply to the somatic system that exists in our body. We have so many other functional systems too. So to understand that, I'll be briefly describing you all the 8 functional systems or the functional components of our body. So we have in total 7 functional components. First, write 4 afferents. We have to write it from up to down direction, or we can say top to bottom direction. So first write 4 A's, then write 4 efferents from down to top. Okay. Now, visceral is always protected inside. So if I draw an imaginary line just to the middle of these components which we are writing, so viscerals are written over the middle part and the somatic component, that is S, is written over the peripheral part. Means हम somatics S बाहर वाले दो में लिखेंगे and visceral V हम अंदर वाले दो में लिखेंगे. So this is V and somatic component are outside. Then we have to follow a simple rule. When you are going from outside to inside, the first word आपने special then general, पहले special then general. ऐसे ही बाहर से अंदर आएंगे from top side, special then general, then special then general. So we can say in total हमने 8 components form किए. But as I said, we only have 7 components which exist. So the special somatic efferent which has been formed at this break doesn't exist. So there is nothing like special somatic efferent. All the other components, what does they mean are special visceral component. Whenever you talk about special visceral component, either it is afferent or efferent, doesn't matter, it is bringing sensation or giving the output to any organ. If it is related to special viscera, that means special viscera are the components which are derived from the pharyngeal arches. So we'll study it in the head and neck portion, that pharyngeal arches give rise to the components, majority of which lies in the head and neck region. So the head and neck region में बहुत सारे muscles and the glandular portions will be there, where the afferent and efferent portions will be mediated by these components. So these are special visceral components. Okay. Now another you see is in the viscera there is general visceral component. The general visceral component, either it is afferent or efferent, it is subjected to autonomic nervous system. It means when you talk about sympathetic and parasympathetic system and you talk about the sensations in terms of the pressure inside the organ, or the pH change, pressure change. So these are the pressure and the pH, these are the afferent component of the autonomic nervous system. And efferent component are like glands may, there is stimulation and they release secretions, or in the case of vasomotor constriction. These are the efferents of the autonomic nervous system mediated by various receptors, right? So we are clear with the special visceral and the general visceral component. Apart from this, when I talk about the special somatic component, as already discussed, there is no special somatic efferent component, but special somatic afferent is something, a sense that is an afferent component which is very special. So like hearing or balance. So the cranial nerve 8th, which mediates these 2 senses, is derived from the special somatic afferent component of the functional column. Left over is general somatic afferent and general somatic efferent. And since these are general soma, so these are the general terms which we know in general, the normal sensory items. For an example, temperature, touch, or pressure, which is applied on the skin, for an example. They are carried through these sensory nerves to the general somatic afferent component in the brain or the spinal cord. Motor is the general somatic efferent component, means the normal motor. The neuron is ending onto the muscle at NMJ, and then the muscle will contract. Which muscles will contract? The skeletal muscles, muscles of limbs, hands. So these are the motor components. Okay. So having discussed all the components, all the functional components, I should make this clear, and it is but obvious also, since the cranial nerve number 8, the vestibular and the cochlear nerve, and the special visceral component, they are associated with the head and neck region. So it is but obvious that these components wouldn't be appreciated into the cut section of the spinal cord. You can see them where? In the brainstem. Okay, but the other components, that is the general somatic afferent, general somatic efferent, the basic sensory and motor components, which we have already discussed in this diagram, that is the sensory cells of posterior horn. They are nothing but the general somatic afferent, general somatic afferent, and these motor cells of afferent horn, they are they are coming out from what? General somatic efferent component of the spinal cord. So these are present on the spinal cord, and the autonomic nervous system, that is the general visceral afferent and efferent, is also present in the spinal cord. It is appreciated well for the sympathetic nervous system as the lateral horn in thoracic 1 to L1, L2 level, and for the parasympathetic nervous system, the nerve fibers are not in such a bulk that a separate lateral horn will be appreciated on the spinal cord section. Now, after discussing about all the functional components, and after knowing that, yes, spinal cord will have general somatic afferent, general somatic efferent component, and this is general visceral component, right? Now, as I discussed, that general visceral component has afferent as well as efferent. This afferent, which is general visceral part, and this afferent, which is general somatic part, once they enter inside the spinal cord, they'll take the same pathway. It means they'll go along with each other. You cannot discriminate in the spinal cord that these two fibers are different. You can discriminate only their pathways outside the spinal cord when they are entering. कि ये sympathetic fibers के along आ रहा है, and ये हमारे somatic fibers के along आ रहा है, simple general somatic fibers के along, और वो general visceral fibers के along आ रहा है. Okay. Now the spinal nerve, which is coming out of the spinal cord, how is it formed? Let's discuss about it. Now let's talk about the neuron. We have a pseudo-unipolar neuron, in which you see that there is the body, there is the nucleus, and then you can see two processes. There is a central process and there is a peripheral process. So these neurons are called as pseudo-unipolar neurons. These neurons you will find into the sensory ganglion, which is dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion, which you will see associated with the posterior root. And there is another neuron, which is the multipolar neuron, because it has one long axon and so many dendrites. So this is normal multipolar neuron, and this neuron you will find in case of most of the cases, like the motor neuron, where you have a nucleus and a body, very small appendages which are called as dendrites. They are numerous in number, and the other single one long fiber like structure, that is the axon. Now on the cut section, I'll not say it's exactly the cut section, but when you see a cut section of the thorax, so on the posterior aspect is present the spinal cord, but you know the nerve has to supply its afferents and efferents, so it has to supply all the components to the anterior wall as well as to the posterior wall. So we have to trace how the sensory component is being supplied and how the motor component is being supplied. So the anterior cutaneous branches which are present on the anterior wall of the thorax, these anterior cutaneous branches, when run along the thoracic wall, will curve around and will enter the dorsal root ganglion. So these branches which are coming from the periphery, what are these? They are nothing but the peripheral process of these pseudo-unipolar neurons. This is the body of these neurons, and their central processes will then run into the posterior root, ending inside the dorsal horn, and then this will follow its path along the sensory component of the spinal cord. We'll discuss about all the columns later on. Now, the motor component, after motor component is present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. So the anterior root arises from the anterior horn, it will join the sensory root after the posterior root ganglion. And when the sensory peripheral process of sensory column joins with this motor neuron, it forms a spinal neuron. So spinal neuron has what? Sensory plus motor neuron. So sensory neuron ka which part? Peripheral process. Now the spinal neuron formed. When you see with the eyes, you can see there will be the two nerves which are arising from it. There is an anterior division and there is a posterior division. The posterior division supplying the back, the anterior division supplying the anterior or tracing to the anterior thoracic wall. And we can notice another thing here, that the anterior division is attached to the sympathetic trunk. I am not saying it's a sympathetic ganglion because it can have different fates. It can go to the sympathetic ganglion to the sympathetic trunk. So you will see that it's sympathetic ganglion or sympathetic trunk which is connected with the gray rami and white rami to this anterior division of the spinal nerve. What are these gray and white rami? The gray rami, they are the component of sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers which would be arising from this lateral horn. These fibers will also run along the posterior root. They will bypass the ganglion. They will not form any synapse. They don't have any sort of bodies inside the posterior root ganglion. They'll just pass through it and they'll enter the gray ramus. There is this preganglionic fiber. It can enter the ganglion, can synapse here with the postganglionic neuron, which can then further supply the organs. The preganglionic fiber may enter inside the sympathetic trunk and can run along the length of the sympathetic trunk. For example, it is running in the upward direction and then it will form the synapse with the postganglionic neuron in the cervical ganglion, not in the thoracic ganglion from where it was originally arising, because we know that sympathetic system is arising from T1 to L2, right? So it may just bypass the ganglion which is adjacent to its spinal column, and it will cross along the length of the spinal sympathetic chain, and then it will form the synapse with the postganglionic neuron in another ganglion, for example cervical ganglion, and then it will supply the structures. Or it may just bypass that ganglion and then it will directly reach to the plexus which is closest to the organ, for an example celiac plexus. And such preganglionic fibers, since they are long enough that they are reaching to the organ, they are called as splanchnic nerves, and we'll be discussing in the adjacent videos that these splanchnic nerves can be great, lesser or least. Now I would like to draw your attention towards the point that what is the anatomical location of these structures. The sensory root, sensory or the posterior horn ganglion or the dorsal horn ganglion, and the motor root, they are present inside the spinal or the vertebral canal, I can say. They'll be below the arch, means you cannot appreciate them outside the vertebral column. They are hidden inside these structures, the lamina of the vertebra. But the spinal nerve, you will see the spinal nerve coming out of the intervertebral foramen that is present between the two vertebra. So between two vertebra there is intervertebral foramen, and from this you can see spinal nerve arises. So the spinal nerve can go towards the posterior direction or the anterior direction. So this is the anterior division, this is the posterior division. They will supply the respective parts, and these are the gray ramus and the white ramus, and this is the sympathetic ganglion. So you can see sympathetic ganglion is present on the lateral aspect of the body of the vertebra. So it is different, its location is different at different places. And at the bottom, both the sympathetic chain will join together at a single ganglion called as ganglion impar. Okay, these are the ganglions, and complete is a sympathetic chain. Now completing the remaining part of this diagram, the gray ramus, which are the pre-ganglionic sympathetic system fibers, it is myelinated. White ramus are non-myelinated. They are postganglionic fibers. They'll join the spinal nerve only, and now they'll accompany the spinal nerve and supply all the areas which are supplied by the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve, its anterior division, it ends up into the anterior cutaneous branch, and on the lateral aspect it gives the lateral cutaneous branch to supply the lateral thoracic wall. So in total we have anterior cutaneous branch which supplies anterior portion, lateral cutaneous branch which supplies the lateral portion of thoracic wall, and there is a posterior division of the spinal nerve which supplies the posterior aspect of the thoracic wall.